Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. It's been a big week for the economy. On Monday, New South Wales lifted restrictions and National Australia Bank estimates around $100 million was spent in retail outlets on that day alone, almost double the previous week. Then on Tuesday, NAB released its business confidence survey showing confidence has rebounded in some of the hardest hit sectors, albeit not quite what it was. Wednesday saw the Federal Treasurer estimating the economy had contracted by about 3% in the September quarter. And then yesterday, the labour force data was released, that's for September, with the jobless rate up slightly to 4.6%, although employment fell by 138,000 for the month. As I said, a big week. Alan Oster is the Chief Economist at National Australia Bank and joins me again this morning. Alan, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
Let's start with the labour force. What did you make of yesterday's numbers?
Oh, look, it's clearly a weak result. You don't every day lose, 138,000 jobs, having lost roughly 140,000 the month before. But it's really all about essentially what's happening with the virus. The participation rate fell a lot. And the reason for that is that, if you're getting COVID payments or you're being paid the dole and your industry shut down, you're not looking for new work. So therefore, you're not counted as unemployed. So I would basically say it's a weak result, not unexpected. Participation rates sort of hiding some of the deterioration. So one of the other ways you can look at it is you can say, well, if I add back to the unemployment numbers, the number of people who are working 0 hours or have, quote, left the labour force since the middle of this year, then the unemployment rate would be 8.7.
Wow.
So I think that's a better perspective. I think the idea that unemployment's not going up much is true, but under very strict, essentially, definitions.
Okay, so as we go forward, do you think that the job losses and the falling in participation has peaked?
Well, I would suspect that there'll still be some hangover in terms of job losses. We've got some internal data that we look at each week, and early October was saying to us that it wasn't getting any better. But as we go forward, you would expect, as New South Wales and increasingly Victoria reopen, people would then start looking for a job, and therefore the participation rate would go up, and unemployment, well, I think it probably will go up a little bit more, but then hopefully in 6 to 12 months' time, it'll be down to, say, 4.5% again.
Right. Where do you think employment will get to eventually in the next 12, 18 months?
We have employment, growing pretty strongly during the course of the next year. So we have 4.3% growth in GDP, and we have the levels of unemployment essentially reversing what we've had recently, essentially by the middle of next year, and the labour market, hopefully by the end of next year, will be behaving what I might call more normally.
Okay. So how does that flow through to, growth? You've just told me 4.3%, but then interest rates?
Oh, interest rates, I think, are a long way away from change. For us, a couple of things. The Reserve Bank is basically saying, look, in some sectors, there's been increases in inflation, particularly things like agriculture, in terms of supply chain things in construction and manufacturing, etc. But generally, it's not increasing wages. And if they're going to adopt a rule that says we're going to wait until inflation gets to 2.5%, not just in our forecast, but in the actual numbers, then you really need wages growth of 3.5%, because productivity is roughly 1%.
Right.
And wages growth at present is 1.7%. So I think you're going to see increase in interest rates at the very earliest by late 23, but more realistically, I think early 24.
Okay. Now, onto retail spending, I mentioned the National Australia Bank figures of about $100 million on Monday, and that's an unusual spike. There's also about $200 billion, I think, sitting in savings accounts in places like NAB and the other banks.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, when is it that people start spending that saving? What is it in the mindset that they think, I don't have to save anymore?
Well, I think you're probably going to find there's another dynamic that we look at. We look at what we call cash flow. In other words, dollars coming in versus dollars going out.
Yep.
And roughly, it's nowhere near what happened last year, so they don't have as much spare cash as they previously had. And if you're sort of spending the same amount or a little bit more than you're actually getting new income coming in, we've typically found the consumer will be a bit cautious. So we do see consumption picking up, mainly because we're reopening. rather than because the consumer's going to go out and have a party and spend huge amounts of money. Sure, they'll go and have a haircut, they'll go out to a restaurant, etc., etc. But I suspect the recovery in consumption is more about reopening rather than consumers spending the savings.
Okay. And that'll be the same when Victoria eventually reopens?
I think that, yeah, that's basically the same case. So we're seeing the same thing. It's not really a lot of difference across states. And some of those deposits are going to disappear. Some of those deposits, without getting into the technicalities, were created essentially because of QE, the government buying bonds. And when the government stops buying as many bonds, those sort of deposits disappear. So I wouldn't assume just because you've got a big increase in the savings rate that the consumer is going to go out and spend it hugely. But it is a factor that will help. I mean, the other thing you see is that this time last year, all the spending was pretty much in essentially setting yourself up in an office. In other words, you're buying a new computer, new desk, doing internal renovations. Unless you really did a really bad job, you don't need to do that again. And so some of the discretionary retail numbers we're looking at present don't look as good as you might expect, and certainly nothing like last year.
Stay with me, Alan. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to National Australia Bank Chief Economist Alan Oster. Okay, so let's get on to business confidence and your survey, which was released on Tuesday.
Yep.
Some of the hardest hit sectors, retail, recreation and personal services, wholesale trade, they all saw a big rise. Yeah, tell us about that.
There's two areas of the survey that are important. Number one is confidence, but more importantly and more related to GDP is what we call business conditions, or if you like, forward orders. What are you doing for sales, profits? What are you doing for employment? Everything in the survey that looked at actual outcomes for September fell, and fell a lot. Mm-hmm. What happened, however, was when you talk about confidence, you say, the question broadly says, well, compared to where you're going now, do you think next month's going to be better? And so you saw some of the biggest increases in confidence in New South Wales that I've ever seen. So it went from something like minus 20 to plus 28 or something. So it had a 42-point turnaround, which is the biggest I've seen in a survey since the late 80s in New South Wales. And you also saw a pretty big jump everywhere in Victoria.
Yep.
And everywhere else, it fell. So I think really what the survey was saying is things are tough in the real world, but gee, I'm really optimistic that once I reopen, then things are going to be a lot better. And that's the way I'd sort of expect to see it happening. So I would expect to see business outcomes in October being better than what they were in September.
Do you think business and consumers will be worried about the numbers of COVID cases when reopening occurs? Now, Victoria hit a record yesterday.
I think it's not so much New South Wales and Victoria because, they're saying we're going to reopen anyway.
Yeah.
I think the interesting question might be what happens if you're in some of the areas like Western Australia and Tassie, maybe to some extent Queensland, where you're really not used to having virus and then suddenly the virus turns up. That might be also interesting to watch. Hard to sort of say, but really when we're looking at the numbers, what we're saying is, look, in the short term, maybe GDP fell. Our forecasts haven't changed for ages. We've had September minus 3.5. Why? Because our internal data is about half the fall of what happened last year, and last year it fell 7%. Mm-hmm. And a sort of a kickback at about 2% in the December quarter. What I thought was interesting, and you mentioned it, was that the Treasurer is out talking about we're expecting GDP to fall by 3 or even more. But in context, up until this week, he'd been saying we expect GDP to fall by 2 or even more. So I think someone in Treasury has told him -2 is probably too low. So he's sort of out there signalling that when you get a -3 or whatever, that's not a big surprise.
Okay, a couple of final things. House prices. I can't let you go, Alan, without asking about house prices. We've seen the Council of Financial Regulators come out, give its view. APRA acted on that. Do you think things will cool somewhat?
I think they're already cooling a little bit. So what we're seeing, if you're looking at prices, the peak growth rates have started to come off just about everywhere. But they're still at levels that would scare the hell out of people. So, we're looking at, say, something like 20% increase in house prices over the course of this year. And most of that's already happened. We'd expect something like 3 to 5% in house price increases next year. So we're not expecting falls. But the regulators out there saying, well, the banks need to have a bigger buffer. So if you had let's say, an interest rate of 2%, you have to prove to us now that you can pay it back if rates went to 5, whereas before you had to pay it back if rates went to 4.5. I think it will help slow, but if house prices continue to go up, then I think the regulator will probably come along. And the one that they seem to be signalling, which I find a bit strange, but the government's sort of signalling, is debt to income ratio. So in simple terms, you've got an income of 100,000, you can go to a bank and get 600, but you can't get any more than 600.
Mm-hmm.
And that would have a really big negative impact on first home owners.
Yeah.
So what we're really seeing is we're starting to see affordability issues being a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So that's starting to take a little bit of heat out. The APRA changes to the buffers will take a little bit more out. And if it doesn't sort of slow it much more significantly, then they might come along with a bit of a sledgehammer and really stop it.
The final question, climate change. Guy Debelle, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, came out yesterday, and you're probably going to correct me here, but I can't remember someone from the bank being quite as strident about the role climate change, not just climate change, but policies around it, consumer demand that actually will have on the economy. I think that's as strong as I've heard the bank talk about it. What's your take on it?
Guy's got a bit of a history, so you're going to say you haven't heard anyone from the bank say this before. Guy's said this before.
Right.
But I think he's basically right. What he's saying is, zero emissions by 2050. If you don't get that, people are going to start to worry about whether you're sustainable into the medium term. And so therefore, the train's already left the station. And if you don't sort of put that in, then they will stop buying your bonds. They will cause some problems. And you're better off to essentially bite the bullet. It's happening anyway, but do it in a gradual phase so that you don't immediately turn off the coal industry. You give it time.
Yep.
And so, it's almost a case that, or it is the case, that coal is good in terms of emergencies, and Europe's finding out, if it's not windy, then there's a bit of a problem. But beyond that, in terms of the cost of production, it's now already cheaper to use renewables than it is to build a new coal plant. Now, if the coal plant's already been built or for power, then it's okay, but you would have to assume that we need to be competitive in energy. And I think someone was telling me the other day that there's 4 big things in terms of getting renewable energy, like copper and things like that. And Australia is in the top 4 producers in 3 of those 4.
Right.
So Australia is still well placed.
Yep.
And so you just need the adjustment, but you do need to do it. Otherwise, you'll get pinged. And you might argue, but we're the only ones, or one of the very few countries in the world that actually have delivered what we said we'd deliver, but that's not the way they look at it.
Alan, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
That was Alan Oster, Chief Economist at National Australia Bank. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.